In this video, we will be focusing on Big Idea 2, which states that biological systems utilize free energy and molecular building blocks to grow, to reproduce, and to maintain dynamic homeostasis. To better understand this big idea, we will break it down into 4 big, enduring understandings. In Enduring Understanding 2a, we will be looking at how growth, reproduction, and the maintenance of the organization of living systems require free energy and matter. When talking about bioenergetics, which is the study of how organisms manage their energy resources, there are 2 main pathways. In catabolic pathways, energy is released by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds, while in anabolic pathways, energy is consumed to build complex molecules from simpler ones. Different organisms have different bioenergetic strategies, which are a response to varying energy availabilities. Bioenergetics is what ultimately limits an animal's behavior, growth, and reproduction. For example, a deer mouse, being an endotherm, will expend a lot of its energy on temperature regulation, whereas a snake, being an ectotherm, will expend no energy at all on thermoregulation. However, it is able to take that energy and expend it somewhere else, like in the production of its eggs. In connecting back to Big Idea 2, biological systems are not able to grow, to reproduce, or to maintain dynamic homeostasis without the availability of free energy. Changes in free energy availability can result in changes in the population size and disruption to an ecosystem, because without free energy, there is a change in the producer level, which can affect the number and the size of the other trophic levels. The most important thing that will ultimately determine the health of an ecosystem is the amount of free energy that is flowing through it. In Enduring Understanding 2b, we will be looking at how growth, reproduction, and dynamic homeostasis require that cells create and maintain internal environments that are different from their external environments. The cell membrane is a great model for the separation of internal environments from external environments. This specialized structure allows the cell to be selectively permeable, which aids in maintaining dynamic homeostasis by the constant movement of molecules across the membrane. Molecules such as hydrophobic and small uncharged polar molecules can easily penetrate through the membrane. However, molecules such as large uncharged polar molecules and ions cannot, because of the special properties of the phospholipid bilayer. Growth and dynamic homeostasis are maintained by the constant movement of molecules across membranes. Such molecules include water molecules. Water molecules play a big role in determining the health of a cell. If an animal cell is placed in a hypotonic solution, water will move from an area of high to low concentration, eventually causing the cell to lyse. If an animal cell is placed in a hypertonic solution, water will move out of the cell and attempt to dilute the solute, causing the cell to shrivel. This is why it is important for the cell to maintain an adequate flow of water in and out of the cell. So how does this connect back to Big Idea 2? When maintaining homeostasis, concentration gradients are created. Concentration gradients are important in building up potential energy. Potential energy is energy that can later be converted to kinetic energy or work energy. Without energy, nothing on the ecosystem, population, organism, or cellular level is able to function properly. And as we know, without energy, biological systems are not able to grow, reproduce, or maintain dynamic homeostasis. In Enduring Understanding 2c, we will be looking at how organisms use feedback mechanisms to regulate growth, reproduction, and to maintain dynamic homeostasis. There are 2 types of feedback mechanisms, positive and negative. Negative feedback mechanisms maintain dynamic homeostasis for a particular variable by regulating physiological processes, returning the changing condition back to its target set point. Now let's look at some examples of negative feedback mechanisms in both plants and animals. A good example of a negative feedback mechanism in humans is the regulation of blood glucose levels. As they begin to rise, it is detected by the insulin-secreting cells of the pancreas. The pancreas will then secrete the hormone insulin, causing liver cells to take up the glucose and store it as glycogen. As the body cells take up blood glucose, the glucose levels in the blood decline and the insulin release stops. This is a good example of a negative feedback mechanism because the blood glucose levels return back to their initial set point, maintaining homeostasis. A good example of a negative feedback mechanism in plants is a plant's response to water limitations. As water becomes scarce, ABA will affect second messengers such as calcium. This will cause potassium channels in the plasma membrane of guard cells to open, leading to massive loss of potassium ions from the cell. The accompanying osmotic loss of water reduces guard cell turgor and leads to the closing of stomatal pores, preventing further water loss and keeping the plant at dynamic homeostasis. Another type of feedback mechanism is a positive feedback mechanism. These mechanisms amplify responses and processes in biological organisms. Unlike negative feedback mechanisms, the variable initiating the response is moved further away from the initial set point. As you can see in the graph, amplification occurs when the stimulus is further activated, which in turn initiates an additional response that produces system change. A good example of a positive feedback mechanism in animals is the onset of childbirth. A series of strong rhythmic uterine contractions will bring about the birth. Estrogens induce the oxytocin receptors in the uterus. The oxytocin will then stimulate the uterus to contract and stimulate the placenta to make prostaglandins. Prostaglandins stimulate more contractions of the uterus and cause more oxytocin to be produced, which amplifies the contractions, thereby, in the end, forcing the fetus out of the uterus and through the vagina. A good example of a positive feedback mechanism in plants is fruit ripening. Fruit ripening is triggered by ethylene production. As an individual fruit is ripening, ethylene will trigger its ripening, and its ripening will trigger more ethylene production. This results in a huge burst of ethylene production which spreads from fruit to fruit. This is an example of a positive feedback because it is an amplified response. The variable initiating the response is moved further away from the initial set point with the increased ethylene production. So how does this connect back to Big Idea 2? Feedback mechanisms are important because they give organisms a way of responding to their external environments. Without feedback mechanisms, organisms will not be able to maintain dynamic homeostasis between their internal and external environments. If organisms were not able to do so, they would not be able to regulate growth, reproduction, or maintain dynamic homeostasis. This leads into our last enduring understanding, that growth and dynamic homeostasis of a biological system are influenced by changes in the system's environment. The environment is one of the biggest factors at play in our world. An organism will not only have interactions between biotic factors, but also abiotic factors on the ecosystem, population, organism, and even cellular level. Cell activities are affected by interactions with biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors that influence cell activities are density-dependent inhibition, which is when crowded cells stop dividing, and anchorage dependence, which is a phenomenon in which cells must be attached to a substratum in order to divide. Biotic factors that affect cells are biofilms, which are metabolic cooperations between different prokaryotic species. These can help in communication, finding food when it is scarce, and providing protection in harsh environments. Organisms like cells are also affected by the interactions with biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors that influence organisms are changes in the environment, such as temperature and precipitation. Biotic factors that affect organisms are things such as the predator-prey relationship, which is a density-dependent population control where there is a biological interaction between the predator and its prey. Disruptions to dynamic homeostasis of biological systems can not only cause problems locally but worldwide. Specifically, the greenhouse effect. CO2, water vapor, and other greenhouse gases reflect infrared radiation back towards Earth. With the increased levels of atmospheric CO2, the greenhouse effect has been magnified, which could possibly cause global warming and climatic change. With an increase in global temperature, this can affect the dynamics of ecosystems worldwide. So how does this all connect back to Big Idea 2? Biological systems must be able to respond to changes in a system's environment, meaning they must be able to interact with not only biotic but abiotic factors as well. If a biological system suffers any disruptions to their dynamic homeostasis, this could have a deleterious effect. Thank you for watching, and I hope you now have a better understanding of Big Idea 2.